Hey guys, tonight I'm going to tell you a story about one of the most fascinating women who ever lived. Her name was Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's step back in time together. The desert winds carried with them the soft whisper of centuries. Along the banks of the Nile, the river that had nourished Egypt for thousands of years, the land seemed eternal. The pyramids of Giza stood as silent guardians, their golden stones glowing in the sun. Ancient temples carved with hieroglyphs told stories of gods, kings, and the passage of time. Yet beneath this surface of timeless grandeur, Egypt was changing. By the time Cleopatra was born, in the year 69 BCE, her kingdom no longer commanded the power it once had. For centuries, Egypt had been ruled not by native pharaohs, but by the descendants of Ptolemy, a Macedonian general who had served under Alexander the Great. When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was hailed as a liberator. But after his death, his empire was divided, and Ptolemy seized Egypt for himself. He and his heirs became pharaohs. Yet they were Greek in language and culture. They built libraries, brought scholars to Alexandria, and kept alive the traditions of both Greece and Egypt. It was a strange blending of worlds. On the one hand, the worship of Egyptian gods like Isis and Horus. On the other, Greek philosophy and theater. Cleopatra was born into this unique dynasty, the Ptolemies, who had ruled for nearly 300 years. Unlike most of her ancestors, she did not turn away from Egyptian culture. Many of the Ptolemaic kings and queens had cared little for the language of the people they ruled, speaking only Greek and living like foreign monarchs in the heart of Egypt. But Cleopatra would be different. She was one of the few in her family to learn Egyptian, and her people loved her for it. To them, she was not just a Greek queen in name, she was Pharaoh, the living goddess, the daughter of Isis. Her childhood was shaped by both luxury and danger. The palace at Alexandria was filled with marble halls, gardens scented with lotus blossoms, and classrooms where tutors taught mathematics, philosophy, history, and science. Cleopatra learned from some of the greatest minds of her time. She spoke not only Greek and Egyptian, but several other languages, including Hebrew, Aramaic, and Latin. She could debate with philosophers, converse with priests, and negotiate with merchants. From an early age, she prepared herself for leadership. Yet life in the royal family was never safe. The Ptolemies were notorious for their rivalries, betrayals, and even murders. Brothers turned against sisters, parents against children, all in the desperate struggle for the throne. Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy XII, known as Aletzer, the flute player, had a precarious hold on power. He was unpopular with the people and often relied on bribes to maintain his crown. At one point, he was driven out of Egypt altogether and forced to seek support in Rome. Cleopatra grew up knowing that survival required intelligence, charm, and caution. As she matured, Cleopatra developed qualities that would set her apart. She was not known for being the most beautiful woman of her time. Despite the legends that later grew around her, ancient writers described her beauty as secondary to her charisma. What truly captivated those around her was her presence, her wit, her intelligence, her voice. They said her speech was like music, her words like honey, her ability to charm irresistible. She could disarm enemies and win allies not just with looks, but with her brilliant mind and persuasive nature. During her teenage years, Egypt's political situation grew increasingly fragile. Rome, the rising power in the Mediterranean, was extending its influence. Egypt, with its fertile land and endless supply of grain, was a prize too tempting to ignore. Cleopatra's father relied heavily on Roman support to keep his throne, and in return, he allowed Rome greater influence over Egyptian affairs. This created resentment among his subjects, who saw him as weak and corrupt. Cleopatra watched these events closely, learning how foreign powers could both support and threaten her kingdom. By the time she reached her late teens, Cleopatra was ready to step into the turbulent stage of Egyptian politics. When her father died in 51 BCE, she and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, were named co-rulers. As was tradition, Cleopatra was just 18 years old, yet she now bore the weight of an ancient kingdom upon her shoulders. At first, she tried to rule alongside her brother, but the partnership quickly crumbled. Influenced by his advisors, Ptolemy XIII pushed Cleopatra aside, forcing her into exile. But Cleopatra was not one to surrender. Exile did not mean defeat. She gathered allies, planned her return, and bided her time. Fate, it seemed, would soon place her in the path of Rome's most powerful man, Julius Caesar, and with that meeting, her life, and the fate of Egypt, would change forever. Cleopatra's exile did not break her spirit. Far from the marble halls of Alexandria, she plotted her return. She knew that in Egypt, appearances mattered, and that a queen could not simply march back and demand her throne. She needed strength, allies, and perhaps most importantly, timing. Fortune, as it often does in history, intervened, for across the Mediterranean, a storm of politics and war was brewing in Rome, and it would soon reach the shores of Egypt. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar, one of Rome's greatest generals, arrived in Alexandria. He was in pursuit of his rival, Pompey the Great, with whom he had been locked in a bitter civil war. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping to find sanctuary with the boy king, Ptolemy XIII. Instead, he found treachery. Ptolemy advisors, eager to win Caesar's favor, betrayed Pompey and had him murdered on Egyptian soil. They thought Caesar would be pleased by this gift. But when Pompey's severed head was presented to him, Caesar turned away in disgust. He had wanted to defeat Pompey himself, not see him cut down by assassins. Now Caesar remained in Alexandria, and Egypt became the stage for new struggles. Cleopatra knew this was her moment. She needed Caesar's support if she was to reclaim her throne. But the palace was controlled by her brother's faction, and she could not simply walk in and meet the Roman general. So she devised a daring plan. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into the palace wrapped in a carpet, some say it was a linen sack, and presented as a gift to Caesar. When the coverings were undone, out stepped Cleopatra, graceful and unafraid. Imagine the scene: the flickering torches of the palace, the whispers of Roman soldiers, the surprise in Caesar's eyes as this young queen revealed herself. Cleopatra was only about 21 years old, Caesar nearly 52, yet the connection between them was instant. She spoke with charm and confidence, presenting her case not as a victim, but as a rightful ruler who needed an ally. Caesar, ever the strategist, saw in her not only beauty and intelligence, but also political advantage. Egypt's wealth and grain could be a valuable resource for him in Rome's wars. Caesar agreed to support Cleopatra, but this decision ignited a conflict within Alexandria. Ptolemy XIII and his forces would not give up power so easily. Soon, the city was engulfed in fighting. Roman soldiers clashed with Egyptian troops, and the royal family's divisions spilled into the streets. Cleopatra stood alongside Caesar, not as a passive figure, but as a partner in the struggle. Together, they faced months of siege within Alexandria's palace. It was during this time that one of history's greatest losses occurred. The Library of Alexandria, with its countless scrolls of knowledge from across the ancient world, was caught in the chaos. Flames spread, and although we may never know the full extent of the damage, many believe that priceless works of science, literature, and history were lost forever. While war raged outside, Cleopatra and Caesar endured, their bond growing stronger. Eventually, Ptolemy XIII's forces were defeated. The young king himself drowned in the Nile while trying to flee. Cleopatra, at last, was restored to her throne. She would rule as queen, though officially she was still co-ruler, now with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. Yet in truth, Cleopatra held the power, and by her side was Caesar. Their partnership was not only political, but personal. Cleopatra became his lover, and soon, she gave birth to a son. She named him Caesarion, Little Caesar, declaring him the son of the greatest Roman of the age. For Egypt, this was more than scandal or romance. It was strategy. By aligning herself with Caesar, Cleopatra ensured her kingdom's survival in a world dominated by Rome. Her reign was secure, her enemies crushed, her image renewed. She presented herself to her people not only as Pharaoh, the daughter of Isis, but also as a ruler who could stand alongside Rome's greatest general. In the months that followed, Cleopatra sailed with Caesar along the Nile. Imagine the royal barge gliding through the waters, its sails billowing, its decks filled with musicians and servants. Caesar, who had seen the cities of Gaul, the fields of Spain, and the streets of Rome, now marveled at the wonders of Egypt, the temples, the statues, the endless river stretching through the desert. Cleopatra used this journey to impress upon him the majesty of her land, reminding him that Egypt was not a minor kingdom, but a nation as ancient and proud as Rome itself. And yet, she knew their time together was limited. Caesar's destiny lay in Rome, where power was always contested and dangerous. In 46 BCE, he summoned Cleopatra to join him there. She traveled with great splendor, bringing her young son and appearing in Rome as a queen of unmatched grace. The Romans were fascinated, some enchanted, others scandalized. Statues of Cleopatra as Isis were erected in Caesar's villa, and whispers spread about the foreign queen who had captured their leader's heart. For Cleopatra, Rome was a dazzling yet treacherous stage. She watched as Caesar reformed laws, planned great projects, and even began to style himself as more than just a man, as a figure nearly divine. Some in Rome adored him, but many feared his ambition. And while Cleopatra walked in his gardens and attended his feasts, she too must have sensed the danger. For in the heart of Rome, daggers were already being sharpened. Cleopatra's time in Rome was like a dream balanced on the edge of a blade. For nearly 2 years she lived in the city, her presence both dazzling and unsettling to the Romans. She appeared at feasts and festivals, traveling through the streets in regal processions, always accompanied by her young son, Caesarion. For some Romans, she was a figure of fascination, a queen from the East who brought with her the wisdom of Egypt and the allure of ancient royalty. But for others, she was a symbol of danger, a reminder that Caesar himself was reaching beyond the bounds of tradition, aligning himself with foreign powers and monarchs. Julius Caesar, meanwhile, was reshaping Rome. He enacted laws to ease debt, reformed the calendar, and began massive construction projects. He accepted honors that made him appear more like a king than a republican leader, a golden chair in the Senate, a laurel crown that he wore even in public, and, most dangerously, whispers of a plan to be declared king of Rome. To Romans, the word king carried a dark memory. Centuries earlier, their ancestors had cast out monarchs and vowed never to bow to one again. Cleopatra must have watched these developments with both pride and apprehension. She had bound her fate to Caesar, and as long as he remained secure, so too did Egypt's independence. But beneath the marble columns and crowded forums, discontent grew. Senators plotted in secret, fearing Caesar's power would eclipse the republic itself. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, the dream shattered. Caesar entered the Senate, unsuspecting. A group of senators, men he had trusted, surrounded him. Blades flashed in the dim chamber. Cleopatra was not there, but the news must have reached her swiftly. Julius Caesar, her protector, her ally, the father of her child, lay dead at the base of Pompey's statue, struck down by more than 20 wounds. For Cleopatra, the moment was devastating. In an instant, the man who had restored her throne and given her a place in Rome's heart of power was gone. And worse still, his death threw the entire Roman world into chaos. She had to decide quickly: remain in a city now hostile and uncertain, or return to Egypt and protect her own future. She chose the latter. Gathering Caesarion and her household, she departed Rome, leaving behind statues, memories, and unfinished dreams. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra faced the immense challenge of securing her rule. Without Caesar, her position was far more precarious. Her co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, still technically shared the throne, though in truth he was little more than a name. Soon after their return, the young king died under mysterious circumstances. Many believe Cleopatra had a hand in his death, quietly removing a rival so that her son Caesarion could be declared co-ruler in his place. Whether by design or fate, Egypt now stood under Cleopatra's sole authority, with Caesarion as her heir. Meanwhile, Rome descended into civil war once again. Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, claimed they had restored liberty. But others rallied to Caesar's memory. His loyal supporters, including Mark Antony and the young Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, rose to challenge them. Cleopatra watched from afar, knowing that the outcome in Rome would shape her destiny in Egypt. If the Republic collapsed, she needed to ensure that Egypt stood on the side of the victors. In these years, Cleopatra ruled with strength and vision. She presented herself not only as queen but as the embodiment of the goddess Isis. A mother, a protector, and a divine ruler. Her court became a center of learning and luxury. Poets, philosophers, and scientists found a place in Alexandria, keeping alive the city's ancient reputation as a beacon of knowledge. Yet behind the splendor, Cleopatra never forgot the precariousness of her throne. Egypt's wealth was vast, but Rome's legions were stronger. Her survival depended on diplomacy as much as power. The tides of war eventually brought Rome back to her shores. In 41 BCE, Mark Antony, one of Caesar's greatest generals and now one of the most powerful men in Rome, summoned Cleopatra to meet him. He ruled the eastern provinces of Rome's empire, and Egypt lay within his sphere of influence. For Cleopatra, this meeting would be decisive. She remembered how aligning herself with Caesar had secured her reign. Now, perhaps, another Roman could serve as both protector and partner. The story of their meeting has echoed through centuries. Told in plays, poems, and paintings, Cleopatra sailed to Antony not as a supplicant, but as a queen displaying her majesty. Her barge floated down the Cydnus River, its sails dyed purple, its oars of silver flashing in the sunlight. Perfumes filled the air, and musicians played sweet melodies as attendants dressed as cupids fanned her. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy of gold, radiating confidence and charm. Antony, a soldier hardened by battle, was captivated. Their bond was swift and powerful. Antony found in Cleopatra not only beauty but intellect, wit, and ambition equal to his own. She, in turn, saw in him a protector who could match Rome's might with personal loyalty. Together, they forged an alliance that was both political and deeply personal. Cleopatra entertained him in Alexandria with lavish feasts, where the tables glittered with jewels and the wine flowed endlessly. Yet behind the extravagance lay strategy. Cleopatra knew that in Antony she had secured the means to protect Egypt once more. For the Romans, their relationship was scandalous. Antony was already married, and his alliance with a foreign queen alarmed many in Rome. But for Cleopatra, the partnership was vital. With Antony's support, she strengthened Egypt's defenses, restored its economy, and expanded her influence across the eastern Mediterranean. She bore him children, twins, a boy named Alexander Helios and a girl named Cleopatra Selene, followed later by another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Through them, she dreamed of a dynasty that could unite East and West under her lineage. And so, Cleopatra's story, once tied to Caesar, now entwined with Antony's. But as history often shows, love and power are never free from conflict. Far to the west, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, watched with growing unease. To him, Cleopatra was not a queen but a threat, and Antony's devotion to her was proof of his betrayal of Rome. Storm clouds gathered again, and Cleopatra, ever the strategist, prepared for the battles ahead. She had survived exile, palace intrigue, and the fall of her first Roman ally. Now she stood at the side of another, her fate once more bound to the destiny of Rome. The years that followed Cleopatra's union with Mark Antony were filled with both triumph and looming shadows. In Alexandria, the queen and her Roman ally lived in dazzling splendor, their lives entwined in love, politics, and the dream of a shared empire. To their supporters, they seemed like a pair chosen by the gods themselves. Antony, the great general who had marched with Caesar, and Cleopatra, the living goddess Isis, ruler of Egypt. Together, they embodied strength, wealth, and vision. But to Rome, their partnership appeared dangerous. Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar and Antony's rival for power, saw every feast in Alexandria, every gift of land, and every child born to the couple as proof that Antony had abandoned Rome for an Egyptian queen. Slowly, Octavian began weaving a narrative that would shape the course of history, that Antony was bewitched, enslaved by Cleopatra's charms, and that Egypt threatened the very heart of Rome. Within Alexandria's palaces, however, Cleopatra pursued her ambitions with clarity. She and Antony formed what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, a grand ceremony in which Antony declared their children rulers of vast lands. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was named King of Kings and hailed as the true heir of Caesar himself. Alexander Helios was given dominion over Armenia and Parthia, while Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica, and the youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was granted Syria and Asia Minor. The spectacle was magnificent. Cleopatra, dressed as Isis, sat upon a golden throne, and Antony, arrayed as Dionysus, the god of revelry, stood beside her. Their children, adorned in jewels and robes, were presented to the people as the heirs of a dynasty that could rival Rome's might. For Egypt, it was a moment of pride, a sign that their queen's vision stretched far beyond her own borders. But in Rome, news of the donations struck like thunder. Octavian seized the moment, declaring that Antony had betrayed his duty, handing Roman lands to foreigners and raising a foreign child, Caesarion, as the true successor of Caesar. The propaganda war had begun. Octavian circulated tales of Cleopatra's excesses, her golden banquets, and the way Antony knelt before her as though she were his queen and goddess. He claimed Antony had given away his loyalty, his honor, even his Roman identity, all for the sake of Cleopatra. To the proud citizens of Rome, this was intolerable. Antony, once a hero, was now painted as a traitor enslaved by the East. Cleopatra understood the danger, but she also believed in her power to stand against it. She prepared Egypt for war, strengthening its fleet and stockpiling resources. Her ships, sleek and fast, were the pride of the Mediterranean. Her wealth, drawn from the fertile Nile and the bustling trade routes of Alexandria, could sustain armies for years. And by Antony's side, she believed Rome itself could be challenged. Antony, too, was not blind to the threat. He returned to Rome briefly, attempting to mend alliances, but the rift between him and Octavian was too deep. When he finally returned to Cleopatra, it was clear that the lines had been drawn. War was inevitable. In the years that followed, the lovers' bond was tested by distance and conflict. Antony led campaigns in the east, fighting against Parthia, while Cleopatra remained in Egypt, ruling with firmness and grace. Letters crossed the deserts and seas, carrying words of affection and strategy. For Antony, the East had become his world, and Cleopatra its brightest star. For Cleopatra, Antony was both a partner and a shield against Rome's relentless hunger. But Octavian was relentless, patient and calculating. He tightened his grip on Rome, portraying himself as the defender of tradition and the avenger of Caesar. His speeches painted Antony as a man lost, a Roman no more, a figure corrupted by Cleopatra's luxuries. In the Senate, he declared that the safety of Rome required action. And soon, the Republic was called to arms. The stage was set for one of history's greatest confrontations, Rome, led by Octavian, against Antony and Cleopatra, rulers of the East. It was more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of visions, of cultures, of two destinies. Cleopatra, who had once been smuggled into a palace rolled in a carpet, who had survived betrayal, war, and exile, now stood at the threshold of her greatest trial. On summer nights in Alexandria, as the moonlight shimmered on the waters of the harbor, Cleopatra must have walked the palace gardens with Antony. Speaking of dreams and fears, she was no longer the young queen seeking Caesar's aid, nor the uncertain ruler overshadowed by her father's weakness. She was the mother of heirs, the partner of one of Rome's most powerful men, and the architect of a vision that sought to restore Egypt's glory. And yet, deep in her heart, she must have known how precarious it all was. The world had shifted before, with Caesar's death, with Rome's endless civil wars, and it could shift again. Still, she faced the future with the same qualities that had defined her since childhood: intelligence, courage, and an unshakable will. As the winds of destiny gathered, Antony and Cleopatra prepared their forces. In the harbors of Alexandria, hundreds of ships were readied, their sails mended, their oars polished, soldiers trained in the courtyards, their armor gleaming in the sun. Cleopatra herself oversaw preparations, ensuring that Egypt's strength would be felt on the battlefield. For this was not merely Antony's war, it was hers as well. Soon, the clash that would decide the fate of Egypt, of Antony, and of Cleopatra herself, loomed on the horizon, and with it, the question that history would forever ask: could love and ambition stand against the might of Rome? The year was 32 BCE, and the world seemed to hold its breath. From Alexandria to Rome, from the deserts of Egypt to the hills of Italy, whispers of war carried on the wind. The alliance of Antony and Cleopatra had grown too powerful, too provocative, for Octavian to ignore. Their children had been given crowns. Their fleets and armies had swelled. and their vision of an Eastern empire threatened Rome's dominance. For Octavian, it was no longer a question of rivalry but of survival. In Alexandria, preparations for war filled the days and nights. Cleopatra walked among her people, urging confidence, reminding them of Egypt's ancient greatness. She visited the temples, offering prayers to Isis and Osiris, and consulted with her advisors on matters of ships, grain, and gold. Her treasury, filled with the riches of the Nile, poured resources into the fleet. Carpenters and sailors labored in the harbors, building and outfitting the vessels that would sail against Rome. Antony, too, devoted himself to the cause. Though a soldier by nature, he now faced a conflict not of swift battles but of strategy and endurance. Together with Cleopatra, he commanded a fleet of more than 500 ships, many of them massive war galleys bristling with soldiers and archers. Their combined forces stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, from Greece to Syria, a testament to their reach and ambition. But Octavian was no less prepared. Though younger than Antony, he possessed a calculating mind and an iron will. He gathered his legions, secured alliances, and, most importantly, controlled the narrative. In Rome, his propaganda painted Cleopatra as a sorceress who had ensnared Antony, turning him against his homeland. Statues and coins reminded citizens of Octavian's loyalty to Rome and his role as Caesar's rightful heir. The Senate, swayed by his arguments, declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra herself. To the Romans, this was no civil war. It was a struggle against a foreign queen who dared to challenge their supremacy. The decisive moment came in 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra sailed with their fleet to the coast of Greece, where they anchored near a place called Actium. Octavian's navy, commanded by his brilliant general Agrippa, moved to block them. For months, the two sides faced each other, each waiting for an opportunity. Supplies ran low, disease spread through the camps, and tension weighed heavily on both armies. Cleopatra remained at Antony's side, a visible symbol of unity, her presence inspiring loyalty among the Egyptians and their allies. At last, on a September morning, the battle began. The sea churned with the movement of hundreds of ships, their oars beating like drums against the water. The air was filled with the clash of metal, the cries of sailors, and the crackle of flaming arrows. Cleopatra's ships, larger and heavier, struggled to maneuver, while Agrippa's fleet, lighter and swifter, pressed the attack. Antony fought fiercely, commanding his men with the courage that had once made him Rome's greatest general. But as the battle raged, Cleopatra made a fateful decision. With her fleet endangered and the tide turning against them, she ordered her 60 ships to break through the lines and retreat to the open sea. Her sails, bright against the smoke, caught the wind, and the Egyptian fleet began to withdraw. Antony, seeing his queen depart, made a choice that stunned his men. He left the battle to follow her. Abandoning the fight, he leapt aboard a smaller vessel and raced after Cleopatra, leaving his soldiers behind to face the crushing force of Octavian's navy. The result was disaster. Without their leaders, Antony's forces faltered. One by one, his ships were captured or destroyed, until the sea itself seemed littered with wreckage. Octavian's victory was absolute, and the fate of Antony and Cleopatra was sealed. Their retreat carried them back to Egypt, but they were no longer the rulers of a vast alliance. Their dreams of empire had shattered on the waters of Actium. In Alexandria, they tried to regroup, to prepare for the inevitable invasion. Cleopatra still held her treasures, her fortresses, and her city, but she knew that Octavian would not stop until Egypt itself was his. For Antony, the defeat weighed heavily. Once a hero of Rome, he was now a fugitive, remembered not for his victories but for the moment he abandoned his men to follow Cleopatra. Yet even in despair, their bond remained. Together, they resolved to face whatever destiny awaited them. Cleopatra, ever resourceful, did not give up. She sent envoys to Octavian, offering her submission, perhaps even hoping to save Egypt by bargaining with her wealth. She spoke of Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, as the rightful heir of Rome, appealing to Caesar's legacy. But Octavian was unmoved. He knew that Cleopatra alive, and Caesarion living, were threats to his power. The queen, who had once captivated Julius Caesar and stood proudly beside Mark Antony, now faced her final trial. The story of her life had always been bound to the fate of Rome, and now, With Octavian's legions marching toward Alexandria, that fate drew near its end. And so, as the waters of the Nile shimmered under the sun and the shadows of war stretched across Egypt, Cleopatra prepared for her last stand, not merely as a queen, but as a woman determined to meet destiny on her own terms. The summer of 30 BCE dawned heavy with foreboding. In Alexandria, the streets were quieter than usual. Though the city had not yet seen battle, merchants still called out their wares in the marketplace. Fishermen still cast their nets along the harbor, and the priests still lit incense in the temples. Yet an unease settled over the people, for word had spread. Octavian was coming. His armies, victorious at Actium, marched steadily toward Egypt, and his fleet, swift and disciplined, cut through the Mediterranean like a blade. Within the royal palace, Cleopatra and Antony clung to what remained of their power. They held the walls of Alexandria, and they had loyal soldiers. But they could no longer deny reality. The empire they had dreamed of building had collapsed, and Rome's wrath pressed closer every day. Antony, once the great general of Julius Caesar, sank into despair. He drank heavily, wandering the halls with a haunted look in his eyes, his thoughts turning again and again to his failures. His soldiers, though still devoted, felt the weight of his hopelessness. Cleopatra, though equally aware of their dire position, refused to succumb. Her spirit was too strong, her pride too deep. She retreated often to her private chambers, where she studied strategies, consulted her advisors, and considered her options. She had sent envoys to Octavian with offers of surrender, but his replies were cold. He would accept nothing less than total submission, and perhaps he meant to parade her in chains through Rome, as he had done with other conquered rulers. That, Cleopatra vowed, she would never allow. The days grew hotter as summer reached its height. Outside the palace, the Alexandrians watched as Antony prepared for one last defense. He rallied his men, trying to recover his old strength, and made speeches promising that Rome would not break Egypt's spirit. Cleopatra, dressed in royal splendor, appeared beside him at the barracks, reminding the soldiers that they fought not only for their queen but for their land, their families, their gods. The cheers that followed were sincere, but beneath them lay fear. When Octavian's forces finally arrived, Alexandria trembled. His legions, disciplined and ruthless, encircled the city. His ships blocked the harbor. The people of Egypt had seen foreign armies before, but this was different. This was not a raid or a skirmish, it was the end of independence. The final step in Rome's conquest of the ancient Nile kingdom. The first clashes were fierce. Antony led his cavalry in person, charging into Octavian's troops with flashes of his old brilliance. For a moment, his men believed victory might still be possible. But Octavian's soldiers were too numerous, too organized, and the tide quickly turned. One by one, Antony's allies surrendered or defected, leaving him more isolated with each passing day. Cleopatra, watching from the palace walls, knew the truth. The city would not hold. The question was no longer how to win but how to face defeat. And so, she began to prepare for the unthinkable. She had already ordered the construction of a mausoleum, a grand tomb near the palace where she intended to be laid to rest with Antony. Surrounded by treasures and symbols of Egypt's glory, it was not merely a place for the dead, it was a message to the living. If Rome would take her life, she would at least choose how her story ended. Inside the palace, tensions grew unbearable. Rumors swirled that Cleopatra was negotiating secretly with Octavian, hoping to spare herself and her children. Antony, hearing these whispers, was tormented. Did his queen still love him? Or had she turned to his rival in a desperate attempt to survive? His heart, already weighed down by defeat, could not bear the thought of betrayal. Then came the moment that shattered him. One day, word reached Antony that Cleopatra had locked herself in her mausoleum, surrounded by her treasures, and that she intended to die rather than be taken by Octavian. The news struck Antony like a blade. Believing her already gone, he cried out in despair. What was left for him? He asked, if Cleopatra was no more? In a haze of grief, Antony did the unthinkable. He drew his sword and fell upon it, seeking to join her in death. The wound was deep, but not immediately fatal. His soldiers, horrified, rushed to him. Even as he bled, Antony asked only one thing, that he be taken to Cleopatra. When word reached the queen that Antony yet lived, She sent servants to bring him to her, too fearful of Octavian's troops to open the gates of the mausoleum. She had Antony hoisted up through a window by ropes and the strength of her attendants. As he was lifted, pale and trembling, Cleopatra leaned out, reaching for him. At last, they pulled him inside, and she cradled him in her arms. There, in the dim light of the mausoleum, surrounded by the treasures of Egypt, Mark Antony died. He looked upon Cleopatra, the woman for whom he had given up Rome, power, and life itself, and with his last breath, he declared that he loved her, that he had lived and died for her. Cleopatra, weeping, pressed her lips to his and mourned the passing of the man who had been her partner in both ambition and love. Outside, the city was falling. Octavian's forces pressed closer, and his banners fluttered above Alexandria. But within her mausoleum, Cleopatra was now alone, left to decide how her own story would end. She knew Octavian would soon come for her. She knew he would wish to march her through Rome in chains, a spectacle to cement his victory. And she knew, with unshakable certainty, that she would never allow herself to be paraded as a trophy. If her reign must end, then it would end on her own terms. And so, as Antony lay lifeless beside her, Cleopatra turned her thoughts not to surrender, but to the final act of defiance that would make her immortal. The mausoleum was quiet now, save for the muffled sounds of soldiers outside and the distant cries of Alexandria, a city crumbling under Rome's advance. Cleopatra sat beside Antony's body, her heart torn between grief and resolve. She stroked his hand one last time, remembering the fire of his laughter, the boldness of his spirit, and the way he had once seemed invincible. But now he was gone, and she was left to face the storm alone. Not long after Antony's death, Octavian entered Alexandria. His troops marched through the streets, their armor flashing in the sun, their discipline unshaken. The people of the city watched in silence, their fate sealed. Egypt, the ancient land of pharaohs, temples, and gods, now belonged to Rome. Octavian moved quickly to secure the palace. He was only 32 years old, yet already master of the Roman world. Calm, calculating, and mercilessly ambitious, he wasted no time in sending envoys to Cleopatra. He demanded her surrender, but also offered her life, on his terms. She would be taken to Rome, paraded in chains as a conquered queen, and displayed before the people to glorify his triumph. When this message reached Cleopatra, she felt a chill deeper than grief. To be humiliated before the crowds of Rome, dragged as a prisoner, was a fate worse than death. She had lived her life as a queen, worshipped as a goddess, admired as a woman of intelligence and charm. To lose all dignity now was unthinkable. Still, Cleopatra was clever. She agreed to meet with Octavian. Dressed in her royal garments, she presented herself with dignity, even as sorrow shadowed her face. When the two stood face to face, history itself seemed to hold its breath. Octavian looked upon her, and though he was known for his cold heart, he did not fail to recognize her majesty. She spoke to him not as a prisoner, but as a queen, offering loyalty, treasures, and submission if only her children might be spared. Her voice was calm, her bearing regal, her every word carefully chosen. Yet Octavian, though outwardly respectful, remained unmoved. He had already decided her fate. Egypt would be absorbed into the Roman Empire, and Cleopatra would serve as the symbol of its conquest. As the days passed, Cleopatra's resolve hardened. She sent secret messengers to allies, but none could come to her aid. She spent long hours in her mausoleum, surrounded by gold, jewels, and the relics of Egypt's greatness. Priests came to perform rites, servants whispered in fear, and her children lingered close by, sensing the storm to come. It was then that Cleopatra made her final choice. If Rome would not grant her freedom, she would take it for herself. She would not live to be paraded in chains. She would not let Octavian write the last page of her story. The details of her final hours have been told and retold, their truth blurred by time. Some say she arranged for a basket of figs to be delivered to her, hiding within it the serpent of Egypt, the asp, sacred to the goddess Isis. Others believe she carried poison hidden in a hairpin, or that her attendants smuggled venom in a jar of ointment. However it came to her, Cleopatra held in her hands the instrument of her release. On the appointed day, she bathed and dressed herself in royal robes, as though preparing for a coronation rather than death. She placed upon her head the diadem of Egypt, the circlet of gold worn by pharaohs for centuries. Around her stood two loyal servants, Iris and Charmian, who had resolved to share their mistress's fate. Cleopatra looked once more upon her children, pressing them to her heart, whispering words of love and sorrow. She prayed that Octavian would spare them, that they might live even if Egypt was lost. Then, with calm grace, she withdrew into the chamber of her mausoleum. There, surrounded by treasures that spoke of Egypt's ancient glory, Cleopatra lay upon a golden couch. She reached for the basket that had been brought to her, lifted the cloth, and revealed the serpent within. The asp, coiled and waiting, was both death and deliverance. To Egyptians, its bite was not only an ending but a passage into the eternal embrace of the gods. Cleopatra took the snake in her hands. She did not tremble. She pressed it to her skin, and as the fangs pierced her flesh, a shiver ran through her body. Pain gave way to stillness, and stillness to peace. Her eyes closed, her breath slowed, and the queen who had defied Rome, loved kings and generals, and ruled as the last pharaoh of Egypt, slipped quietly from the world. When Octavian's men discovered her, it was too late. Cleopatra lay lifeless, adorned in royal splendor, her face serene. Beside her, Iris had already passed, and Charmian, though weak, adjusted her mistress's crown with trembling hands before collapsing herself. Octavian stood over Cleopatra's body, and though he had won his victory, he felt a pang of frustration. He had hoped to drag her in triumph through Rome, to show her conquered. Instead, she had chosen her own end, denying him that spectacle. Yet even in death, Cleopatra's power endured. Her story was no longer Rome's to shape, it belonged to eternity. She was laid to rest with Antony, just as she had wished, their tomb a final testament to their love and their fall. Together, they passed into legend, their names forever entwined. For Egypt, however, there was no return. With Cleopatra's death, the line of pharaohs ended. The Ptolemaic dynasty was no more, and Egypt became a province of Rome. The temples still rose from the desert, the Nile still flooded its fields, and the people still prayed to their gods. But the land's independence was gone. Yet Cleopatra's spirit lingered. To her people, she became a symbol of defiance and pride. To Rome, she was remembered as both enchantress and enemy. And through the centuries that followed, poets, historians, and dreamers carried her story forward, until her name was spoken not as a queen of the past but as a legend of timeless fascination. Thus ended the life of Cleopatra, daughter of the Nile, lover of Rome's mightiest men, and the last pharaoh of Egypt. The death of Cleopatra sent ripples far beyond the walls of Alexandria. For Egypt, it was the end of an age. For Rome, it was the crowning jewel of Octavian's conquest. Yet even as Octavian celebrated his triumph, the figure of Cleopatra lingered like a shadow, unconquered in spirit. Even if her body now rested in the tomb she had chosen. In the weeks after her passing, Octavian secured Alexandria and all of Egypt. The treasures of the Ptolemies, gold, jewels, scrolls, and sacred relics, were seized and shipped to Rome. The granaries of the Nile, filled each year by the river's fertile flood, would now feed the legions of the empire. Egypt was no longer a kingdom but a possession, its wealth flowing into Roman coffers. Octavian, ever calculating, made certain that Cleopatra was buried beside Antony with dignity. Perhaps it was a gesture of respect, or perhaps it was simply a way to silence unrest among the Egyptians. Whatever his reasons, the tomb became a place of legend, though its exact location would be lost to time. The queen's children faced uncertain fates. Cleopatra had 4, Caesarion, the son she bore with Julius Caesar, and 3 children by Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Octavian, wary of any threat to his power, ordered Caesarion's death. The boy was only 17, but as the son of Caesar, he represented a dangerous rival. Too many Caesars is not good, Octavian is said to have remarked coldly, sealing the youth's fate. The other children, younger and less threatening, were taken to Rome. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter who bore her mother's name, would later marry a North African king and live a quieter life than the one her mother had known. Yet even she carried within her the flame of the Ptolemies, passing it on through generations that would weave the blood of Cleopatra into distant dynasties. Back in Rome, Octavian celebrated his triumph. The city erupted in parades and festivals as he returned victorious. The treasures of Egypt dazzled the crowds. And statues of Cleopatra, captured or recreated, were displayed as symbols of Rome's dominance. But though the Romans cheered Octavian, many could not help but feel a fascination with the queen who had defied him. Poets began to sing of her. Horace wrote verses describing her as a doomed temptress who dared to stand against Rome. Propertius, another poet, cast her as a dangerous beauty whose downfall was inevitable. Later, historians like Plutarch and Dio would shape her image further, painting her alternately as seductress, schemer, and tragic heroine. In each retelling, Cleopatra grew less like a mortal queen and more like a legend. For centuries afterward, her memory shimmered at the edge of history and myth. In medieval Europe, she appeared in moral tales as a warning against pride and passion. During the Renaissance, artists painted her death in rich colors, imagining her reclining on golden couches, draped in silk, with the serpent at her breast. To them, she was both beautiful and doomed, a figure of irresistible allure and fatal destiny. But what was the truth? Beneath the myths, the real Cleopatra was far more than the caricature drawn by her enemies. She had been a linguist who spoke the tongues of her people, a scholar who studied with the finest minds of Alexandria, and a ruler who steered her kingdom through the storm of Rome's rise. She had loved, yes, but she had also governed. She had faced impossible choices. And though her reign ended in defeat, she never surrendered her dignity. Her story, passed from age to age, became a mirror in which each generation saw what it wished. To some, she was a cautionary tale of ambition punished by fate. To others, she was a romantic figure, a woman who defied the world for love. And to many more, she became a symbol of female power, intelligence, and independence in a world dominated by men. Meanwhile, Egypt itself lived on, though no longer free. The temples continued to rise, their hieroglyphs carved deep into stone. Farmers still sowed their crops in the black soil left by the Nile's floods. Priests still lit lamps before statues of Isis and Horus. But now Roman governors ruled from Alexandria, and legionaries walked the streets where pharaohs once strode. The old gods remained, but new shrines to Roman deities appeared beside them. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, would rule for decades, becoming the first emperor of Rome. Under his reign, the empire entered a time of stability and grandeur, the Pax Romana. Yet even in Rome's golden age, the memory of Cleopatra flickered like a torch in the darkness, a reminder that not all victories were complete, and not all conquered rulers were truly silenced. Her legend reached across borders, carried in whispers and tales. Merchants spoke of her in distant markets, travelers recounted her story in foreign lands. And always, the image endured: Cleopatra, the queen of the Nile, who lived with brilliance and died with dignity, leaving behind a mystery that time itself could not erase. As the centuries stretched on, the sands of Egypt shifted, hiding her tomb and Antony's beneath layers of history. The Library of Alexandria, once the jewel of knowledge, fell to ruin, its scrolls lost. Yet still, the memory of Cleopatra survived, not in stone or parchment, but in the imagination of humanity. In every retelling, she was reborn. Some saw her as a seductress, others as a patriot queen. Some emphasized her romances, others her politics, but all agreed on one thing: Cleopatra was unforgettable. And perhaps that was her greatest victory. Though Rome claimed her kingdom, though her dynasty ended, though the world she knew faded into dust, her story endured, shimmering like the Nile under the moonlight, eternal and undying. As the centuries passed, the story of Cleopatra traveled far from the banks of the Nile. Her name, whispered in the streets of Alexandria and carved into the records of Rome, drifted across time into new lands and new minds. And though the sands of Egypt swallowed her tomb, her legend refused to be buried. In the medieval world, her story appeared in chronicles and moral tales. To Christian writers of the Middle Ages, Cleopatra often became a cautionary figure, a queen whose ambition and passions led to ruin. They told of her as a sinner whose pride brought down her kingdom, weaving her life into lessons about humility, chastity, and the dangers of worldly power. Yet even in these somber retellings, a strange fascination lingered. She was still remembered for her intelligence, her beauty, and the dramatic way she chose her end. Then, during the Renaissance, Cleopatra's image began to transform again. Artists, poets, and scholars looked back to the classical world with admiration, and in the process, they rediscovered Cleopatra not as a villain but as a figure of wonder. Painters from Italy, France, and Spain filled their canvases with scenes of her death, imagining her reclining on silken couches, draped in pearls, as the asp delivered its fatal kiss. Some works showed her as serene and noble, her death a tragic sacrifice. Others emphasized sensuality, portraying her as both goddess and temptress. In England, the playwright William Shakespeare took up her story in Antony and Cleopatra. His Cleopatra was witty, passionate, and unpredictable, sometimes cruel, sometimes tender, but always commanding. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Shakespeare's lines declared, capturing a truth that seemed to echo across all ages. Cleopatra could not be confined to one image. She was too complex, too alive, even in death. Across Europe, her story became a favorite subject of poets, composers, and dramatists. Operas echoed with her name, symphonies swelled with the drama of her life. To some, she was a heroine of love, dying rather than living without Antony. To others, she was a queen of destiny, choosing death rather than dishonor. And to still others, she was the eternal mystery of womanhood, enigmatic, powerful, and beyond the grasp of men who sought to define her. Meanwhile, scholars searched for the truth behind the legend. In dusty manuscripts and half-burned scrolls, they pieced together fragments of her real reign, her knowledge of languages, her political skill, her bold attempts to preserve Egypt's independence against Rome. Slowly, the outlines of the true Cleopatra emerged. Different from the caricature painted by her enemies, she was not merely a seductress but a strategist, not merely a lover but a leader who had stood at the center of history's storm. As the Enlightenment dawned, philosophers and historians debated her character. Some dismissed her as a manipulator who used beauty to ensnare powerful men. Others defended her as a sovereign forced to wield the only weapons available to a woman in a world ruled by men. Her story, like the glint of sunlight on the Nile, shifted with each perspective, never settling into a single truth. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Cleopatra's image spread even wider. Explorers traveling to Egypt, inspired by Napoleon's campaigns and the growing field of Egyptology, brought back tales of her. Hieroglyphs were deciphered, temples uncovered, and the romance of ancient Egypt captured the European imagination. Cleopatra became the crown jewel of this fascination, the last and most dazzling star of the pharaohs. Painters of the Romantic era filled galleries with her likeness, her dark eyes glowing with intelligence, her posture regal, her robes shimmering with imagined jewels. Poets wrote of her as a woman torn between love and duty, a queen who defied an empire, and novelists spun stories around her, blending fact and fantasy until her life seemed larger than history itself. The Victorians, with their rigid morals and secret longings, were captivated by her. To them, Cleopatra embodied both danger and desire. She was the exotic other, the powerful woman who upset the order of things, the queen who dared to stand equal to men. Writers and critics argued fiercely. Was she a wicked temptress who destroyed Antony, or a courageous ruler who fought for her kingdom's survival? The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere between, for Cleopatra was neither saint nor sinner, neither holy victim nor villain. She was human, yet she carried herself like a goddess. She ruled a land older than Rome, yet she understood the new world that was rising. She loved deeply, yet she never ceased to be a queen. And so, century after century, her image shifted but never faded. While empires rose and fell, while the world changed beyond recognition, Cleopatra's story remained vivid. She became a canvas upon which each generation painted its dreams, fears, and fascinations. For the people of Egypt, she remained the last true pharaoh, the queen who dared to speak their language and honor their gods. For the poets of Europe, she was the eternal muse. For scholars, she was a puzzle waiting to be solved. And for the dreamers of every age, she was the whisper of the Nile at night, the promise of beauty and mystery that could never die. Thus, long after her kingdom had become a province, Cleopatra continued to rule, not from a palace of marble, but from the imagination of the world. The modern era brought with it new eyes and new tools, and Cleopatra's story found fresh life once again. By the 19th century, Europe was gripped by a passion for Egypt. Archaeologists dug through sand and stone, uncovering temples, statues, and tombs that had slept for centuries. With every discovery, fascination with the pharaohs grew, and no figure shone brighter in the popular imagination than Cleopatra, the queen who had loved, ruled, and died with such unforgettable drama. Yet unlike the towering pyramids or the temples of Luxor, Cleopatra's tomb remained elusive. The place where she and Antony had been laid to rest was lost to history. Perhaps destroyed, perhaps buried deep beneath layers of time. Scholars searched, explorers speculated, and rumors swirled of hidden chambers near Alexandria. But still, the queen's final resting place remained shrouded in mystery, as if she herself wished to remain forever untouchable, half in history and half in legend. While archaeologists sought her in the earth, artists and writers resurrected her in imagination. Painters of the 19th century often pictured her at the moment of her death, her skin pale, her lips faintly parted, a serpent at her breast. These images filled galleries, casting her as both beautiful and doomed, both human and divine. Playwrights and novelists expanded the story, blending history with romance until Cleopatra seemed to live not in one version but in dozens, each shaped by the storyteller's own age. Then came the new art of cinema. In the early 20th century, Cleopatra appeared on screen, her story told in flickering black and white. Silent film actresses draped in elaborate costumes brought her to life, their gestures exaggerated to convey her allure and her tragedy. Audiences were captivated, not only by the story but by the visual splendor of Egypt recreated on stage sets and silver screens. With each decade, the image of Cleopatra grew larger. In 1963, Hollywood unveiled one of its grandest productions, Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. The film was dazzling, filled with vast sets, glittering jewels, and scenes of opulence. Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra was glamorous, sharp-tongued, and magnetic, embodying the queen as a woman of irresistible beauty and commanding presence. Richard Burton's Antony matched her with fiery passion, their real-life romance fueling the drama. Though the film nearly bankrupted its studio, it etched Cleopatra even more deeply into the popular imagination, making her a global icon of love, power, and extravagance. Beyond Hollywood, Cleopatra's image appeared in operas, ballets, novels, and poems. She became a muse for musicians and painters, a figure who seemed endlessly adaptable. Sometimes she was portrayed as a tragic heroine, doomed by forces beyond her control. Sometimes as a manipulative seductress, using her charm to ensnare great men. And sometimes as a visionary queen, a leader who dared to stand against the might of Rome. Meanwhile, historians worked to peel away the myths. In libraries and universities, scholars pored over ancient texts, comparing accounts, searching for glimpses of the real woman beneath centuries of legend. They noted her intelligence, her political acumen, her ability to command loyalty. They reminded the world that she had been more than a lover, she had been a ruler who spoke many languages, who studied science and philosophy, who governed a kingdom at a time of immense pressure. For women especially, Cleopatra became a symbol. In an age when female leaders were rare, she represented the possibility of power, intellect, and independence. She showed that a woman could rule, negotiate with emperors, and shape the course of nations. Feminist writers reclaimed her story, challenging the old Roman narratives that had reduced her to beauty alone. Instead, they saw in her the courage of a queen who had faced impossible odds and refused to be erased. In Egypt itself, Cleopatra remained a source of pride. Though she came from the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, she had embraced the language and traditions of her people. Egyptians remembered her not as a foreigner but as their last true pharaoh. The queen who had walked among them, spoken their words, and honored their gods. Statues of her, though rare, still bore the symbols of Isis, linking her to the eternal mother goddess of the Nile. And so, in the modern world, Cleopatra existed in many forms at once. She was a Hollywood star, shimmering in jewels. She was a scholar's subject, debated in academic halls. She was a feminist icon, a reclaimed queen. She was an Egyptian heroine, remembered with pride. And she was still, as she had always been, a mystery, her tomb undiscovered, her true face hidden, her life known only through fragments and echoes. The The fascination endured because Cleopatra was not simple. She could not be defined in one way. She was ruler and lover, scholar and strategist, mother and myth. She was human and yet larger than life. And that complexity kept her alive in imagination, as fresh in the 20th century as she had been in the first. Even today, artists, filmmakers, and writers return to her again and again. Each time, they find something new: strength, tragedy, beauty, wisdom, or defiance. She is eternal because she reflects the endless variety of human dreams and fears. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the search for her tomb resumed with renewed vigor. Archaeologists dug at Taposiris Magna, a temple west of Alexandria, where some believed she and Antony might lie. Others searched the city itself, imagining chambers hidden beneath streets and harbors. Each discovery, though small, sparked hope. Perhaps one day, her resting place would be found, revealing new secrets, or perhaps she would remain hidden forever, her mystery preserved like the still waters of the Nile at night. For now, her story continues not in stone, but in the hearts of those who remember. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, lover of Caesar and Antony, foe of Octavian, remains as alive in legend as she ever was in life. Her eyes still look out from paintings. Her voice still whispers in plays. Her name still conjures images of power, beauty, and tragedy. And so, across the centuries, she endures, not only as the last pharaoh of Egypt, but as one of the most unforgettable figures in all of human history. In the quiet hum of the 21st century, Cleopatra's shadow still stretches long. The queen who once walked the marble halls of Alexandria now walks through modern books, films, classrooms, and imaginations. Her name carries weight, like the ringing of an ancient bell that never quite fades. No matter how many centuries pass, scholars of today approach her with careful eyes, seeking to untangle myth from memory. They know that the Romans painted her as a temptress to tarnish her reputation. And they recognize how artists of later centuries exaggerated her beauty to suit their own fantasies. Yet beyond all of these layers, they find a woman of striking depth, a leader who mastered politics, nurtured learning, and carried a kingdom on her shoulders. In universities, students lean forward as professors describe the queen who spoke 9 languages, who held her own in councils of men, who fought to preserve Egypt's independence. For many, she becomes a mirror reflecting modern struggles for recognition and equality. She is no longer only the queen who loved Caesar and Antony, but the queen who dared to rule in a world where women were expected to remain in shadows. Feminist historians write of her not as a seductress but as a strategist. They point to the policies she enacted to stabilize Egypt's economy, the alliances she forged, and the sheer resilience she showed in an age of empire. In their words, Cleopatra becomes not a woman undone by love, but a woman undone by empire, a victim of the relentless expansion of Rome. Yet one who fought until the end with cunning and courage. In Egypt itself, her legacy takes on an even more personal tone. Tour guides speak her name with pride to visitors from around the world. Museums display coins minted with her profile, fragments of statues carved in her likeness. Though the exact features of her face remain uncertain, was she delicate and refined, or strong and angular? Her presence feels undeniable. Egyptians remember her as a queen who did not abandon her people, but lived among them, speaking their tongue and honoring their traditions. The search for her tomb still stirs the imagination. Archaeologists at Taposiris Magna continue their careful excavations, brushing away sand grain by grain, stone by stone. Each discovery, a chamber, an inscription, a hint of ancient ritual, adds another thread to the tapestry of possibility. Somewhere, perhaps, beneath layers of earth and time, the queen rests in silence, waiting for her story to be uncovered in a more literal sense. But even if her tomb is never found, Cleopatra's true monument may be something greater than stone. It is the way her story has lived on for 2,000 years, retold by each generation in its own voice. Few figures in history have been remembered so vividly, for so long, in so many forms. That endurance speaks not only to her life, but to the human desire to hold on to stories of power, love, and resilience. In modern art, Cleopatra's image continues to shift. Painters reimagine her in bold colors, placing her in contemporary settings. casting her as a timeless figure who belongs not only to the past but to the present. Writers craft novels from her point of view, letting her speak at last in her own imagined voice. Free from Roman distortion, filmmakers toy with new retellings, dreaming of ways to show her as more than glitter and tragedy. And in popular culture, her name remains a symbol. To call someone a Cleopatra is to invoke beauty, intelligence, and allure all at once. Her story threads through music videos, fashion shows, and even advertising, proof that she is not just remembered but continually reborn. For many women around the world, Cleopatra represents more than history. She is a reminder that greatness does not always align with expectations. She shows that leadership can come in many forms, and that even in defeat, dignity can be preserved. Her story inspires those who struggle against impossible odds, reminding them that even in the face of overwhelming power, one can still stand tall, speak boldly, and leave a mark that endures for millennia. Some see her as a symbol of resilience, others as a warning of ambition's cost, still others as an icon of love and tragedy. And in truth, she is all of these at once. For her story cannot be pinned down to one meaning. It is vast, like the Nile itself, winding, branching, feeding many lives and many interpretations. In classrooms, in quiet bedrooms where children fall asleep to her story, in the pages of novels and the glow of screens, Cleopatra lives on. Her life becomes a bedtime history, a tale not only of queens and empires, but of humanity itself, our longing for love, our pursuit of power, our struggle against fate. And as the 21st century marches on, with satellites orbiting above and skyscrapers rising high, the figure of Cleopatra remains steady, like a constellation in the night sky, unchanging yet ever shifting, a queen who belonged to her time, and yet, somehow, to all time. Across the centuries, Cleopatra's story was not merely told, it was used. Every generation that remembered her reshaped her image to serve its own needs. Like a sculptor chiseling the same stone again and again, leaving behind different impressions of the same queen. In Rome, long after her death, Cleopatra became a symbol of dangerous foreign influence. Politicians warned of another Cleopatra whenever they sought to stir fear of powerful women or seductive outsiders. She was remembered less as a ruler and more as a warning. Her story bent into a tool of propaganda. Octavian's descendants, who ruled as emperors, had no reason to celebrate her memory. For them, her death marked Rome's triumph over Egypt, and so she was cast as an exotic enchantress who lured men to ruin. Medieval Europe inherited that vision, though filtered through Christian morality. To monks and scholars, Cleopatra became a cautionary tale of sin and temptation. Her suicide, by their telling, was not a final act of courage but a sign of her despair and godlessness. Plays and sermons portrayed her as a lesson in vanity, a woman who prized beauty and wealth above virtue, and who therefore met a fitting end. Yet the Renaissance, with its hunger for classical learning, rediscovered Cleopatra with new eyes. Artists painted her not only as a sinner but as a tragic heroine. Draped in silks, her arm bared as the asp struck, she became a subject for painters like Guido Reni and Artemisia Gentileschi, who saw in her story both sensuality and sorrow. To them, Cleopatra was not simply a warning but an emblem of human emotion, love, loss, pride, and despair, all captured in a single figure. In Elizabethan England, Cleopatra took on new life in the hands of William Shakespeare. His play Antony and Cleopatra gave her words that still echo in theaters today, words of passion, wit, and defiance. In his verse, she is not just a seductress but a woman of immense power, commanding armies and bending history itself. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is both radiant and flawed, proud and vulnerable, a character alive with contradictions, like the real queen must have been. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European empires expanded, Cleopatra was drawn once more into politics of identity. Colonial powers saw her as part of the exotic East they claimed to dominate. Painters in Paris and London depicted her reclining on golden couches, surrounded by servants, a vision of luxury and decadence that reflected Western fantasies more than ancient truth. Egypt itself, reduced to a backdrop, became a stage on which Europeans projected their dreams of empire. But there were other voices too. In the early stirrings of Egyptian nationalism, Thinkers and writers began to reclaim Cleopatra as their own. To them, she was not a decadent queen of Roman imagination but a patriot who fought to preserve Egypt's independence against overwhelming odds. Her struggle against Rome became a symbol for Egypt's modern struggle against foreign domination. Where Rome had once celebrated her death as a victory, modern Egyptians found in her a reminder of resistance and resilience. The 20th century brought yet another transformation. Hollywood, with its bright lights and wide screens, made Cleopatra a star. The 1963 film Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor, dazzled audiences with glittering costumes, lavish sets, and scenes of romance and betrayal. Though criticized for its excess, the film cemented Cleopatra as a cultural icon. Her image splashed across magazines and billboards around the world. Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal, with violet eyes and commanding presence, left a lasting impression on how millions imagined the queen. And yet, Hollywood's Cleopatra was as much a reflection of its own era as of ancient history. The film mirrored the politics of the 1960s, its fascination with power couples, its struggles with gender roles, its dreams of spectacle and glamour. In the process, Cleopatra became not just a historical figure but a mirror in which modern societies saw themselves. In more recent years, debates about Cleopatra's heritage have sparked passionate conversations. Was she Greek, as her Ptolemaic ancestry suggests? Was she part Egyptian, perhaps through her mother's unknown lineage? Could she represent a blend of cultures, standing at the crossroads of worlds? Each interpretation carries weight, not only for historians but for those who see in Cleopatra a symbol of identity. For many in the African diaspora, Cleopatra has been embraced as a symbol of Black heritage and pride. A queen whose legacy belongs not only to Egypt but to Africa as a whole. For others, her Macedonian Greek ancestry is emphasized, highlighting the complexities of race, culture, and power in the ancient world. What is clear is that Cleopatra continues to matter, not only as history but as a figure through whom people define themselves in the present. Her story has been used to argue about gender, about empire, about race, about love, about ambition. Each telling says as much about the storytellers as it does about the queen. She has been villain and heroine, temptress and strategist, sinner and saint. Through it all, the real Cleopatra, flesh and blood, mind and spirit, remains partly hidden. Like a statue weathered by time. Its features softened but its presence still undeniable. And perhaps that is why she endures. Because in the end, Cleopatra is not one story but many. She is a queen who can be rediscovered endlessly, reshaped to fit the questions and dreams of each age. Her story does not belong to one people or one time. It belongs to the world. To everyone who looks back across centuries and wonders what it means to live, to love, and to lead. For centuries, the sands of Egypt have held Cleopatra's world in silence. Temples, palaces, and tombs, once bright with color and alive with ritual, have crumbled beneath time's patient hand. And yet, the search for Cleopatra has never ceased. Like a whisper across the ages, her presence lingers in the ruins, drawing archaeologists, dreamers, and seekers from around the world. The royal palace of Alexandria, where Cleopatra once walked among marble columns and gazed at the harbor, lies now beneath the sea. Earthquakes and tidal waves struck the coast in late antiquity, sending whole sections of the city into the Mediterranean. Today, divers explore its submerged ruins, swimming past toppled statues of gods and fragments of ancient walls. In the play of light beneath the waves, it is easy to imagine Cleopatra herself passing along those same colonnades, her robes brushing the cool stone. On land, another mystery endures: Cleopatra's final resting place. Ancient writers tell us that after her death, she was buried with Mark Antony in a grand tomb. Yet where that tomb lies has been lost to time. For generations, scholars assumed it was hidden somewhere in Alexandria, swallowed by the sea along with much of the old city. But others believe it may rest farther inland, at a temple complex devoted to Osiris and Isis, the gods of rebirth and eternal life. At a site called Taposiris Magna, not far from modern Alexandria, archaeologists have been searching for years. Led by Dr. Kathleen Martinez, a team has uncovered tunnels, chambers, and artifacts that suggest the site was of great importance in Cleopatra's time. Coins bearing her image have been found, along with inscriptions to the gods she revered. The discovery of a long tunnel deep beneath the temple sparked international excitement. Could it be a pathway to the queen's lost tomb? Each season of excavation brings new discoveries, yet also new mysteries. Human remains, carefully buried, have been unearthed, along with amulets and carvings. Pottery shards tell stories of daily life, while fragments of statues hint at grandeur long faded. And though Cleopatra's tomb has not yet been found, the search itself has become part of her legacy. The queen who so carefully controlled her image in life continues to elude complete capture in death. The fascination with Cleopatra's burial is not only about finding her remains. It is about connecting to her world in a tangible way, bridging the distance of 2 millennia. To stand before her tomb, should it ever be uncovered, would be to stand at the meeting point of myth and history, of imagination and truth. It would allow us to look upon the final chapter of her story not as rumor but as fact, etched in stone. Beyond tombs and temples, other traces of Cleopatra's Egypt survive. Coins minted during her reign still lie in museum cases, showing her profile, sometimes regal, sometimes stylized, always commanding. Papyrus fragments mention decrees she issued, blending Greek precision with Egyptian tradition. Statues, though weathered, hint at the grandeur of a queen who stood at the crossroads of cultures. Each artifact is like a heartbeat, faint but steady, reminding us that Cleopatra was real, not just a story told in whispers. And yet, so much has been lost. The Library of Alexandria, once the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was destroyed long ago. How many scrolls written in Cleopatra's time, perhaps even in her hand, turned to ash in those fires? How many voices of her age were silenced? We can only imagine the knowledge that might have reshaped our understanding of her reign. The absence itself becomes part of the story, a reminder that history is not only what survives, but also what vanishes. Still, Egypt has a way of keeping secrets and revealing them when the time is right. The desert preserves what it claims, wrapping relics in sand until seekers uncover them. The Nile carries memories in its current, just as it once carried barges of stone for temples and ships of merchants filled with spices. Each year, archaeologists uncover something new in Egypt: an inscription, a sealed tomb, a forgotten statue, and each discovery feels like a step closer to Cleopatra. Tourists today walk through the great temples of Luxor and Karnak, or gaze upon the pyramids of Giza, imagining that Cleopatra once knew these places too. She ruled in a time when the pyramids were already ancient, when the Sphinx's face had already stared out at the desert for thousands of years. To her, as to us, these monuments were reminders of Egypt's eternal power, a power she sought to embody in her own reign. What strikes modern seekers most is how her presence endures even in absence. We do not need to find her tomb to feel her shadow. It lingers in the way her story is told, in the fascination that draws countless visitors to Egypt each year, in the art and literature she continues to inspire. Perhaps her greatest monument is not stone or gold but the memory she left behind. A memory powerful enough to command attention for more than 2,000 years. And so the search goes on. With each discovery in Egypt, Cleopatra's world becomes a little clearer. The queen herself may remain elusive, but her presence grows stronger, like a star glimpsed more brightly the longer one gazes into the night sky. Whether her tomb lies beneath the sea, beneath the desert, or forever beyond our reach, Cleopatra's story endures, half history, half legend, always alive. When we think of Cleopatra now, across the distance of 20 centuries, we are not only thinking of a queen, we are thinking of what it means to be human. Her story, though set in the golden sands of Egypt and the marble halls of Alexandria, is also our story, of ambition, of love, of struggle, and of legacy. To speak of Cleopatra is to speak of power. She was born into a world where power was fragile, constantly contested, and yet she found ways to hold it. For nearly 2 decades she kept her throne, steering Egypt through storms of intrigue and the shadow of Rome. Few rulers of her time, male or female, lasted as long or faced such overwhelming odds. In her, we see what it means to fight for survival, not once but again and again. To wake each morning with danger at the door and yet to walk forward anyway. Her story is also one of love. though not the gentle kind found in poems, but the fiery love that changes the course of nations. With Julius Caesar she found protection and perhaps admiration. With Mark Antony she found passion and partnership. These loves were not private, they were public, woven into politics, shaping alliances, and drawing the gaze of the world. Yet within them we can still imagine the beating heart of a woman who desired connection, who sought trust in a world of betrayal. It is easy to forget, behind the crowns and battles, that Cleopatra laughed, wept, and longed, as every human does. But love, for Cleopatra, was never enough to shield her. Her story reminds us of the limits of desire in the face of destiny. The world she lived in was one of empire, and Rome's hunger was boundless. No matter her wit, her charm, her brilliance, she was fated to stand in the path of a power too vast to resist forever. In her fall, we are reminded of the weight of history, that even the strongest individuals are sometimes swept away by tides greater than themselves. Yet if her defeat teaches humility, her resilience teaches courage. Cleopatra did not surrender quietly to her fate. When her armies failed, she sought new strategies. When her allies betrayed her, she found new paths. Even at the end, with Octavian's legions closing in, she chose her own exit rather than be paraded as a captive. In her death, as in her life, she claimed agency, refusing to let her story be written entirely by others. This act, whether by asp, by poison, or by some other secret, has echoed through time as her final declaration, "I am my own." To many, it is this defiance that makes her unforgettable. She was not simply conquered, she chose the manner of her departure. In that choice, she preserved a fragment of dignity, a fragment of control, when all else was lost. Her story is also one of legacy. What we remember of Cleopatra is shaped not only by her life but by the stories told about her afterward. The Romans wrote of her as dangerous, the medievals as sinful, the Renaissance as tragic, the modern world as iconic. Each age saw in her what it wished to see. And so her legacy reminds us that history is never fixed. It is a mirror, changing with the angle of the light, reflecting our own questions and desires as much as the truth of the past. For women, especially, Cleopatra has been both burden and inspiration. Burden, because she was so often reduced to beauty and seduction, as though her worth lay only in her allure. Inspiration, because despite those reductions, she remains remembered as a queen, a leader who wielded power in a world of men. To speak of Cleopatra is to speak of possibility, that a woman could stand at the very heart of history and shape its course. Her life also speaks to the timeless dance between identity and belonging. She was Greek by ancestry, Egyptian by rule, a blend of cultures at the edge of Africa and the Mediterranean. She spoke many tongues, crossed many boundaries, and lived at the meeting point of civilizations. In this, too, she is modern, a reminder that identities are rarely simple, that we are often made of many parts, and that this complexity is not weakness but strength. Perhaps most of all, Cleopatra's story endures because it is beautiful, not in the sense of jewels or silks or painted eyes, but in the way her life carries the full arc of human drama. Triumph and failure, love and loss, hope and despair, all are present in her tale, woven together in a pattern as rich as any tapestry. To hear her story is to be reminded of what it means to live fully, to risk deeply, and to face even the end with courage. As night deepens and we imagine her once more, the young princess in Alexandria, the queen on her golden barge, the mother comforting her children, the woman in her final chamber, we see not only Cleopatra but ourselves. We see the choices we make, the risks we take, the way we, too, hope to leave behind a story worth telling. And like the Nile that still flows beneath the stars, her story continues to move, carrying us along its current, whispering across the centuries. And so, as the story of Cleopatra draws to a close, we find ourselves back where we began, by the banks of the Nile, listening to the quiet whisper of the desert winds. Her life, though long past, still ripples through time like the current of the river, carrying fragments of her voice, her choices, her dreams. She is gone, yet she remains, alive in memory, alive in legend, alive in the way her name still quickens the heart. Think for a moment about the arc of her journey. She was born into a world of marble halls and shifting thrones. A child of intrigue and danger, she grew into a queen who held her own against the most powerful men of her age. speaking their language, meeting them on equal terms, and bending history with her presence. She loved deeply, fought fiercely, and refused to be broken, even when all hope had slipped away. Her story is one of light and shadow. There is triumph in her brilliance, tragedy in her fall, and beauty in her refusal to be forgotten. And though empires rose and fell, though centuries passed and her palace sank beneath the sea, Cleopatra's flame has never been extinguished. That flame still burns, steady and clear, in the imagination of the world. Perhaps that is the truest kind of immortality. Not the immortality of gods or stone monuments, but the immortality of memory. Each time her story is told, whether in a whisper at bedtime, in the pages of a book, or on the stage of a theater, Cleopatra lives again. Each retelling breathes life into her, carrying her forward into new generations, keeping her from fading into silence. As you rest tonight, imagine her world, the shining lighthouse of Alexandria casting its beam across the waves, the library filled with scrolls of wisdom, the gardens of the palace alive with birdsong and the fragrance of jasmine. Picture Cleopatra herself walking through those halls, her eyes bright with curiosity, her voice strong and steady. Picture her gazing across the harbor, where ships from distant lands arrived with treasures and tales, her heart filled with both burden and hope. And then, imagine the stillness after her passing, the quiet city, the soft lapping of waves against stone, the people of Egypt carrying on with their lives even as the queen who spoke their tongue and walked among them was laid to rest. Out of that stillness rose the memory we carry now. The memory that has endured through every storm of time. Cleopatra reminds us that to live is to risk, to love, to strive, and to dream. She reminds us that power can be fleeting, but courage endures. She reminds us that even in defeat, there can be dignity, and even in death, there can be immortality. And so, as the stars wheel slowly overhead and the night grows quiet, let her story rest gently in your heart. It is not only the story of a queen, but the story of humanity itself, our ambitions, our passions, our struggles, and our legacies. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, has spoken across the centuries. Her voice is softer now, carried on the winds of time, but still it reaches us. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you carry her story with you, a story of resilience, of love, of brilliance, and of the eternal dance between fate and freedom. Rest well, and let the Nile's eternal flow carry you gently into dreams.